Okay, everybody. Now, you may have just noticed some slight rearranging on the stage. It's very important because, of course, 4-minute mile has 4 laps, right? Or the mile has 4 laps. So I now have my own chair because I was going to stand, and I've had too long a couple of days, and my legs can't take it anymore. So if that's okay with you, I'm going to sit. But I've now realized my beer is too far away. Leave it there for now. I hope you enjoyed that. That was really fascinating, I think, documentary, which I was very, very keen that people who hadn't seen it got the chance to see it, because I thought it did a couple of things. It really encapsulated Roger's achievement, but it also placed it into some sort of context, which is sometimes difficult for those of us perhaps who weren't born at the time to really understand, and I thought it did a brilliant job of that. But I want to now bring our guests on to chat a little bit about that, and then I'm going to open it up. I'll ask some questions, and I'll be very, very pleased, and we will all be pleased to take some questions from the audience as well. So, playing the Chris Brayshaw role of leading off early on, she's actually the British record holder for the road mile, and very narrowly missed breaking the British records, all about British records, which goes back to the 1980s. Last week, 10 days ago in Monaco. Will you please welcome Morpeth Harrier, Laura Weightman. Laura, if I put you on the far side, thank you very much. Quick hello, how are you doing?
I'm okay.
Good, excellent. Did you enjoy it?
Oh, yes, I did. I was like, what? Oh, yes, I enjoyed the film.
Excellent, good stuff. Now, somebody who, I'm not even sure what her best mile time was. It may well be that her son, Raf's in the audience, who's 8, and Raf ran about 6 minutes something. Hey, Raf, how you doing? What was your time today? 6:26 at 8-year-old, wow. I'm not sure she can run that fast these days, but she is the world record holder in the marathon, Paula Radcliffe.
Thank you.
So, current athlete brings on a bottle of water, former athlete, red wine. That's how it should be. Paula, very quickly, did you enjoy that?
I did. I really enjoyed it.
Excellent, good. You shall be more effusive as we go on, I'm sure. Now, these guys, I'm so delighted they're here, but I've had the privilege of speaking at a couple of memorial events for Sir Roger, and got to meet members of the family, which was hugely, well, I said it was a privilege, but it was also very inspiring, because he was a man who, despite what we've just watched, was somebody who went on to have, you probably read at the end there, a life beyond this wonderful sort of moment in his life, and certainly for those of us of athletes, he's kind of somebody who we all have looked up to, but we always should never forget that people who do these sort of things are just people, and they have families, and they have an impact on them as well. But I'm so pleased that his daughter is with us here today. She came here to study in Durham, so is no stranger to the city. Will you please welcome Charlotte Bannister? I'm going to get it for you. Now, I was sitting next to you watching that documentary. What are your emotions even? I mean, you've obviously seen it before, and you've seen some of those things before, but there was a couple of bits where I get a lump in my throat a little bit, just because it's so inspiring to somebody like me. But what is your reaction when you watch that sort of thing?
I was emotional. My father passed away a year ago in March 2018, but I also felt incredibly privileged to be able to have him still back in my life by being up on screen. And that was so him. You know, everything he said and every way he explained the 4-minute mile and how it was a joint effort between Chataway and Braysher, and that he never thought anything was impossible throughout our whole lives. So I really appreciated that documentary because it talked about the seriousness behind running, but also the dream behind running. So it was really a privilege to see it tonight.
And how much did that, those 4 minutes, those 3 minutes 59.4, how much did that act as I don't know, how did it weave its way through your lives as a family, and what sort of impact do you think it had on him as a father and all the rest of it?
Wow, that's a big question. I like the fact that you, earlier on when we were being interviewed with BBC Radio Newcastle, Steve very kindly sort of emphasised that my father had another life, which wasn't just athletics, but it was also, he was a neurologist, and he was at St Mary's, which you saw in the film, but also the National Hospital of Neurological Diseases in Queen Square. And he became the top, obviously, in the world in his field, which was the autonomic nervous system. And quite recently, my mother, who's 91, actually sends her love and best wishes to everybody here. She'd love to be here herself. But she had enough oomph, and still does, to write a letter to the Times about soldiers who are dying or fainting because of overheating. And that was also one of my father's specialists in his medical field. So living with him as a parent was inspiring, but it certainly wasn't easy. I remember age 6, we were told that I was going to climb Mount Snowdon, which is fine in Wales, top mountain, fine. And so we got up to Snowdonia, and there was a small bottle of water. Sorry about that. Is that better? Yeah. I have to move my cross, which is obviously my profession now. And when we got to the base of the horseshoe, because Mount Snowdon is in a series of mountains, if you call them mountains, 2,000 feet, he said, actually, we're not just doing one, we're going to do all of them today. And I was 6, and we had one bottle of water. And I think I was the youngest person to climb that at that time. And I got a tiny silver pickaxe, I remember. But that was his approach to life. If you can climb one mountain, you can climb 3 or 4. If you can go, 1 mile, you can go many miles. So that was how I was brought up.
I met him on a number of occasions, and he was the sort of person who very quickly turned the conversation away from himself. It was always, so Steve, what are you up to? Talk to me about training. Talk to me about this. I had so many questions which I never got answered because he was, he always seemed as though he didn't really want to talk, or certainly in my presence anyway, but I think I got that from a lot of people, that he was always interested in other people and what they were doing, what they were up to.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. My father was and managed to remain very humble throughout his life, despite his achievements. And there was a level of insecurity, which I think in some ways was very helpful, because he was actually a highly curious man. And though he'd done these things, what really fascinated him was how would Paula or Laura do what they're doing? How would they take the next step? What training were you going through? And his insatiable attempt to find out what made other people tick was something, as a doctor and as an athlete, as chairman of the Sports Council, as a desire to bring sports for all, was something really deep within his DNA. And you could never get out of that. And it doesn't surprise me you didn't. I've still got questions I'd like to ask him, but I didn't have a chance to.
I'll just bring the guys in very, very quickly. Paula, first of all. We all grow up with heroes, and I think for women in particular, you would inevitably look to some inspiring people. I know you've talked people like Greta Weitz and Ingrid Christensen, etc. I mean, what did Roger Bannister's name and what his achievement mean to you as a young athlete? Were you aware? I know your parents.
Yeah, very much aware. I mean, I can remember growing up with the history that had already been made of the 4-minute mile. I was just saying to Charlotte earlier, watching one of the earlier films, I think around about mid-90s, that came out about it, and just really understanding how historic a step that is. I mean, we're talking very much now about the 1:59 marathon, and it won't be the first historic landmark because that's already been done with the 4-minute mile. We used to run so often the mile as children growing up here. The Mile of Miles was a big series when I was in my teens, and I can remember going there. I think you came to one, Peter Elliott came to another to hand out the prizes, and there was a huge history of miling in the UK that isn't really understood, certainly in Europe and probably in the rest of the world.
Laura, when we were talking on the same radio show earlier on, you made a very good point, actually, and Paul has sort of picked up on it, about the men have had, we ran a lot of miles, I think, nowadays, but for the women, there were less opportunities, but now the mile is making a bit of a comeback.
Yeah, I've always felt like the mile's been very iconic, but I feel like it's been a very much a male thing. I think growing up as an athlete, obviously I've always known about the 4-minute mile, and also being coached by yourself. I think it's something I've heard a lot about.
Not from me.
A lot. Steve often references, I often joke with him that he'll often slip into a conversation. I think in the 10 years that Steve's been coaching me, I've heard many a times he'll go, well, that time I ran 3 world records in so many days. I'm like, oh, here we go. But for me, it's quite inspiring to hear about that, and I think you do take it for granted hearing about it quite a lot. But I feel like for the women that it's not something we've had the opportunity to do very much. I've only ran 3 track miles, and I think I've only ran a couple on the roads. So I don't really feel like it's a distance I've had the opportunity to do very much and actually really appreciate how hard the distance is to run. It's probably only been this past year or so that I think I've really appreciated that and actually been able to enjoy it myself. And I think, yeah, it's exciting that the women are getting more opportunities to do it as well and to experience a bit of that history.
When you watch that film, is there anything in it that you kind of go, whoa, either, wow, it sounds like sort of things I think and say, or things that just looked so odd?
I think for me it's amazing to put in perspective to how fast they ran on the track that they ran. And it reminds me of being back in Kenya, where we used to train a lot at altitude on kind of a dirt track, and to see how but no, in kind of not the same kind of track and the technology that we have and the advancements that we have now, to see Roger and those guys running so fast. I think it's incredible to see what they did. But I think watch that documentary is always fascinating and about the simplicity of the training, in the sense of referencing 10-400s there. That's something every single track athlete does now. And it's a training session that they did in preparation for that race. So I think some of those similarities are there. And I think, yes, we've got a lot of advancements in the technology as well that obviously allowed athletes to go faster. I think it's fascinating to see almost just how simple it was as well.
Paula, you've retired, theoretically, for a while now. Apart from injury, which is enforced rest, have you ever had 5 days off?
Yeah. I used to take a month off at the end of each season.
I'm not about rest, but the idea...
I used to rest because I grew up in a club system at Bedford, and we always used to rest 48 hours before a big race. And I can remember my first Golden League, it was then, in Oslo. Andy Norman had got me a place in the 3,000 metres there, and I was sharing with Yvonne Murray. And I got there, and I can remember calling home and saying, they're going for a run. Going for a run and it's the morning of the race. Why are they doing that? Because I always just rested completely for 2 days before, but 5 days, not unless... I think actually one time I came up to race at Durham and I twisted my ankle, and so I'd had to rest, and I didn't know if I was going to be able to race, and so I hadn't been able to train for maybe a week, and I just came up and ran then. But yeah, actually planned into it. I think 5 days is a long time, but 2, absolutely. And
Roger, very famously, did the rounds in the morning at St Mary's and got the train from Paddington up to Oxford.
Yeah, there's a story that says that he missed and went out in his lunchtime, but also in his gynecology lectures. So later on, my mother was very worried when he was delivering babies because he felt that, maybe obstetrician and that wasn't covered. So it's funny because you bring up the track. What I remember is finding his running shoes in the bottom of a cupboard and bringing them out. And they've now actually been, auctioned for charity. But I held those running shoes that he did the 4-minute mile on, and they were literally just a little piece of leather with spikes coming out of them. There was no padding. There was no. It was incredibly primitive, and even to my eyes, many years ago, I just thought, how can you run with that? It was extraordinary. And the other thing is, we used to dress up in his vest, the 3A vest, and that was often taken off us because they thought that it wasn't appropriate for a dressing up box thing. But in many ways, it was the comradeship that you heard about between the three athletes, which I thought was an extraordinary aspect to running. And also at that time, obviously, they were still amateurs. So this sense of, it was actually impossible. He was probably working all the time. So his training technique had to be put around a full-time medical career. And that isn't the case now. So circumstances have changed from the amateur to the professional state.
And talking about his profession, the idea that or any of us would reach the pinnacle of our career, he's broken the 4-minute mile, he wins the mile of the century, thank you very much, I'm off. Not into the sunset, it was almost a sunrise, wasn't it? But from an athletic point of view, that was it. I can't get my head around that. Did he ever talk about whether he thought he could get better or improve, go faster?
Well, I think he faced another challenge, which many people don't know about. But obviously, at the time, I try and say to my children, he was a bit like David Beckham is now in terms of sort of world fame or renown. And then he's doing the ward rounds at St. Mary's, and there are very senior consultants looking at him thinking, you don't know anything about medicine. What are you doing here? And so he had another challenge to prove within the medical community that actually he was fully committed and that he was going to do his very best. So being my father, he did.
And but did he ever? I can't. Regret's not the right word. Was there ever part of him though thought, I wonder if I could have gone quicker, or
no.
Of course he never then went to 56 to what would have been his next Olympics.
I think beating John Landy was the pinnacle, and that there's a statue in Vancouver of John Landy looking back over his shoulder and my father taking over. It's a bronze statue, which I remember age 4 going out to and seeing unveiling. I actually fell in love with a Mountie because I thought they were very handsome, and giving him my teddy bear. But anyway, the focus was on this statue, and I think one of the parts of my father's maturity, I would suppose at that time, was to realize what role running played in his life, but also that he wanted to have something else as well. And what better way to go after beating Landy?
You very kindly asked me to speak at a couple of events, and the event that was at the Royal College of Physicians, I think it was. And I was struck by that community maybe not quite understanding the impact of his running achievement, because in their community he was a colossus of a different type, wasn't he?
He edited what's called The Brain, which is the thickest neurological handbook on neurology, which still is the textbook for medical students. And I remember going to St. Mary's and being strapped to a long kind of bed and turned upside down so that all my blood would rush to my head, and then being monitored at how I felt, and then being turned the other way around and being strapped. So low blood pressure was one of the things that he really cared a lot about. And when one of my brothers hit me so hard that I fainted, when I came round and I was looking for justice, he just said, well, how did you feel about fainting at that moment? So it was challenging at times, I think.
And he, it sounds like that was a bit of a theme, because he used himself experimentally as well, didn't he?
Definitely. And we think, retrospectively, my father died of Parkinson's disease and finally in his last day of pneumonia. But the type of Parkinson's he had was very abnormal and very difficult to diagnose. One professor thought that the type of chemicals that he injected into himself to do his own medical research had brought on this Parkinson's. And what he didn't understand is why no other medical students came forward a second time to be experimented on. And so there was a gap in the research, so he just did it to himself. But yeah, I can't comment because I'm not a neurologist.
Yeah, it was a different time, obviously. But he was. I know that both of you have used, Laura still does, Paula, altitude training. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how many conversations that seemed to be a thing he was incredibly interested in. Just from a sort of physiological point of view, Paula, you're probably good on this, but we'll bring Laura in on this. Because I've got a point about this in a second. So altitude training, just for those who don't know why we do it and why you actually lived there a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there are two reasons. I think there's the physiological reason and there's a psychological reason as well. But the physiological reason is the primary reason that most people go to altitude training. And it's just the fact that the concentration of oxygen in the air is less at altitude, so it feels harder. You're working harder. Your body gets used to being able to work harder. And then you come back down to sea level and it feels so much easier. And sadly, it never feels quite as good as it does the first time. Again, the first time that you come down, you feel like you've got a machine on your back and you're absolutely flying. And it's really, really easy. But basically, all it does is teach your body to work harder, to work more efficiently, and then to come down and work better. And the psychological side is that it's usually in a beautiful place to train, very motivating, and you're away from distractions. So you don't have to go out and do the ward rounds and do all the work around it. You can just focus on training, recovering, training again. And
Laura, you're part of the current endurance squad and your program, the British Athletics through lottery funding, etc. And altitude training works as part of your preparations. But just explain a little bit about why. Because I'm interested in the contrast between Roger's day and sort of your day. So you were away, it was best part 4 or 5 weeks in Boulder before the start of the season. And just sort of briefly describe your day and sort of week of training at that time of the year.
Yeah, so I've just been to Boulder in Colorado, so I spent 4 weeks there. And that's only a mile high, so actually in terms of altitude training...
Only take you 3 minutes 59 to come down.
Should do, sadly doesn't. But in terms of altitude training height, that's actually not very high. A lot of athletes probably go to 1,800 metres as a minimum, up to 2,200, 300 metres, and some athletes go even higher. But we've found over trial and error over a number of years that mile high is probably like kind of my perfect height. So yeah, I spent a great 4 weeks there. And yet that time of year, so that was kind of mid-May to mid-June. So that for me was kind of a big training block of just high mileage, so like 80 miles a week, probably running twice most days, just 2-3 track workouts a week, a couple of gym sessions a week and a couple of other drill sessions. But yeah, different to sort of probably in Roger's times, a lot of rest, a lot of recovery, and a lot of time to sort of relax outside of your running in the day and sort of time to sort of explore where you are and appreciate a beautiful place that you're training in.
I'm going to ask one last question about Roger in relation to that in a second, and then I'm going to throw it open to you guys, so this is your chance. But I'm just going to pick up on this and try and bridge the gap between these two ways of training. Everyone remember a bloke called Brendan Foster? He used to run. For the younger ones, the guy I used to commentate with, the big guy, he used to be a runner. I'm joking, he knows I do that. So Brendan once tells a great story about when Brendan was a 1,500 metre runner miler, and he was starting to train at the level at which Laura's just describing, and starting to do quite a lot of mileage. And he was still living at home and going back and at his mum and dad's in heaven. And one night, when he was heading out into the dark and raining and going, and his dad was like, "Where are you off to?" "I'm off to go and do another 6 or 7 mile run," or whatever he was going to do. And his dad said, "Look, I think you're just getting this all wrong." He said, and apparently his dad sort of looked back to the 50s, and he said, "If you want to run a good hard mile, if you want to run your best mile, all you need to do is to go out and practice running a hard mile. I don't understand why you're doing all these other miles. You should just go out every day and run a mile as fast as you can till you get better at it." Which was, I was interested listening to the kind of your Prespratia thing and your Stamfel and all the rest of it. But what I was going to go on to say is, Roger never lost his deep love of athletics and sport generally, because as said on there, he went on to continue that link, didn't he, in terms of various roles. And he went on to some things which we now rely on around drug testing and all the rest of it. So despite us saying kind of he put a stop to it in 1954, he never ever lost his love for athletics.
Absolutely. And all my childhood, I was taken to White City, and when he was chairman of the Sports Council, we used to be visiting all sumo wrestlers, and then he started Sports for All, and then he tried to get the number of sports centres up. I think when he began, there were 2 or 3 in England, and when he retired, there were 200. So his belief in the fact that sport was absolutely an integral part of being human and flourishing, and that everybody should have access to the ability to be able to fulfill their athletic potential, whether it be through athletics or football or rugby, was central to his philosophy of life. And in actual fact, I just have to, because I'm not sure how long we're going to go on to it, but the book that Steve mentioned that he was given was this one. And he has this lovely thing that I want to read to you. "Running is one of the few sports that anyone can do if they are sufficiently determined. Nobody could have wanted to run more than I did." So his running came from a mental and I would almost say spiritual place, and then the physical came on that. But it was the desire to run and what it did for him, and that pleasure that it had given him as a young man, he wanted to give to others throughout his whole life. And he also commented at the Olympics. I remember being at home and listening to his commentary over the Olympics. So he did some journalism and reporting as well.
It's been remiss of me, actually, you've mentioned spiritual, that aspect of his personality, which is obviously very important to you, and I should have really mentioned at the beginning, and maybe I'll give you the chance to do now, your connection to Durham, if you don't mind. Just let us know that this isn't your first time here, is it, at all?
No, I absolutely love Durham. I was here as an undergraduate, and then I was here as a postgraduate. I did a master's in the geography department, Centre for Overseas Research and Development, and my professor is actually here this evening. He was the most remarkably patient and lovely man, because at the time when I did my thesis, there wasn't a spell check designed. And I remember the printer, when I finally printed it, went, and I remember I never want to hear that sound again. But I'm actually doing a doctorate for my sins. But I didn't do theology here. I did theology in London, and I am actually an ordained priest at the moment. So I'm very, 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 very pleased to be going to the cathedral on Sunday. But Durham has an incredibly special place in my heart.
Okay, I will maybe come back to that right at the end. Can we have the house lights up a touch so I can see? Has anybody got any... Let me get the lights up there. Oh, wow. Oh, dear me. Anybody got any questions for Charlotte or Paula or Laura? Colin, right in the middle. Of me?
Great.
Something about me.
Good question.
My first 4-minute mile, actually, just before I say that, the May the 6th thing, because one of my big breakthrough before I then went on a year later to do that was my first sort of record was breaking the British record at 1,500 meters for a 16-year-old, and it was May the 7th, which
good date.
I know, and my coach went, should have done it yesterday. He said it would have been on the anniversary of the 4-minute mile. I went, Anyway, it was at... actually, Brendan had a role. I'll very, very quickly tell the story because some people in the room might know it. But I was still at school, and my school teacher had neglected to enter me for the county championship, so they were going to not let me run because my school teacher forgot to let me run. I turned up at Gateshead. They said, well, we'll let you run, but you may get disqualified afterwards if any of the other schools complain. I thought, right, I will run so hard. They daren't. And I ran 3:42.8 for 1,500 metres on my own, just went out and ran. And that was the equivalent, that's the equivalent of a 4-minute mile, apparently. I didn't even know that. I then got a telegram. Who remembers telegrams? I got a telegram on the Monday morning. My dad was a policeman. I think he thought I'd been, anyway, he thought I'd done something wrong. Anyway, I got a telegram inviting me to Crystal Palace on this. The reason I got a telegram was the race was the next weekend, and they didn't have time to send a letter. Try telling youngsters these days, Laura, that, eh?
Didn't send a text.
So I went to Crystal Palace, and I didn't know that Brendan had been at the race when I ran 3:42.8, had mentioned it to the powers that be, and so I got a telegram. Went to run the Emsley Carmile, and finished 4th in 3:57 point something, which I can't remember now, which was my first ever 4-minute mile. And we actually just had the Emsley Carmile on Sunday in London in the London Diamond League, so that's a traditional event that's carried on. I don't know how many years Emsley Carmile has been going now.
You've got to say who Emsley Carr is now, haven't you?
Well, if I knew enough about that, I knew you were going to ask me that. You tell us, Paula.
No, I don't know. That's why I'm asking, because Raf asked me.
Anyway, Colin, that was the answer to, that was the first time. And somebody asked, Laura, you did this. Didn't you ask me at dinner, where were we somewhere, and said, how many times have I run the 4-minute mile? When I had yet again mentioned the fact that I'd broken the record for the 4, yeah. When we in...
We were in America, and Steve was talking about breaking the world record for the mile. Again, and someone said, how many times have you done it? And Steve had absolutely no idea. And it turns out you are the most a British person has broken the 4-minute mile by.
Because I started young.
And it's like, is that 30 or 40 times?
35, I think 35, it was.
35,
yeah.
I think. We found out about 35 times, yeah.
That's incredible.
All of them before age 21. Anybody got a... Yes.
Oh, no.
Isla, it's Paula's daughter. Is she allowed to ask a question?
Yes.
No, what time you're getting dinner isn't a real question.
Where did you go altitude training, or did you not go?
Me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I went to Boulder, which is why I sent Laura there now. I went there originally in 1980, I think. Yeah, for the first time. It's amazing the little, until I'd seen this documentary, I hadn't understood the impact on Phil Knight of Nike. And it was actually Nike who allowed me to go altitude training back in 1980. I didn't know anything about it. And I hadn't realised the impact of Roger's achievements on him. That he was in Vancouver and all the rest of it. That was news to me. It was fascinating. Anyway, Boulder, good question, Isla. Well, don't keep asking me questions. One right at the back there.
Yes, a question for Charlotte. Did you start running yourself as well?
I knew that was going to come up. There's this famous story, and forgive me if you've heard it, but my mother met my father after the 4-minute mile, and he was, sort of trying to show off a bit, and she said, "Oh, so what's so great about running 4 miles in a minute?" And that kind of puts the genetics in perspective. So we had a good lecture from Tom, I don't know whether he's here at Lancaster, on DNA Fit this afternoon, which I went to because I was very interested about why I'm not Laura, Paula. So I'm really so proud we've got these fantastic women athletes. I ran every day of my life from the age of 2 to about 18. And then I came to Durham, and I had a choice between athletics and theatre. And it was really clear to me at that time you couldn't be, I was actually, hockey was in fact my best sport. So I trialled for the hockey university team and got in. And I'm afraid King Lear won. So that really, but the other generation, so my children and my nephews and nieces, there are sparks of great athletic genes re-emerging.
I love your mum's comment. I had a great physio called Norman Anderson, and Norman used to lecture. And he was treating me one day, and he was kind of telling me the story. He says, "You won't believe the conversation I had this afternoon." So this was in about 1981, 1982 or something. And one of his students, running the Great North Run, was very new, and she'd said she'd taken up running, and he said, "Oh, great, fantastic. What do you?" She says, "Oh, I ran 5 miles." How? Norman being Norman, he said, "How do you know you?" She said, "Well, it took me 20 minutes." And he said, "No, well, you didn't run 5 miles." And then she said, "I did. My boyfriend measured it in the car." And he went, "No, I'm really sorry, you can't run." And she was quite belligerent. She said, "Well, I'm really sorry, I ran 5 miles, and it took you 20 minutes. Yes, it took me about 20 minutes. He said, "But that's impossible." Now, of course, come back to the Roger thing. And this young lady and he said, "Look, have you heard of Roger Bannister?" She went, "No." He said, "Well, he's the man who broke 4 minutes for the mile. And up until this point, no woman, as far to my knowledge, 1981, has ever done the same. And you've run 5 of them together." And she said, "So?" Anyway, I never forget, it was very interesting. But yes, now we've got better ways of measuring. Okay, I'll go left and I'll come to the front. Yeah, sorry. I'm trying to...
How much faster do you think he could have run today with all the technology we have? You know, different training plans and trainers and tracks and... I mean, the guy on the film there said he was losing about a second on that.
That guy was Seb Carm.
He knows nothing.
So it's a really good question. Oh, okay.
It is.
I think the experts here.
I think it is a really good question, and I think the easiest answer is no one will never know now, because we can't do that. We can't take Sir Roger Bannister then and transplant him onto a Mondo track on a concrete surface with the lightest spikes possible and see what he could have done. I think
and altitude training and nutrition.
Exactly, time to focus on it. Everybody can surmise that he certainly would have run faster, but how much, we really don't know. And I think that's what's so magical about the history, that it's done now, and that was the first time. And then since then, everything has improved so much, and yet the 4-minute barrier is still a barrier. It's still the benchmark for being a top-class athlete now, with all the technology
there's still less than
behind it.
2,000 men ever in the world have broken 4 minutes for the mile. So that Paula's point is right, that it's still, for any young athlete coming up, the first thing they look to is to try to break 4 minutes for the mile, because that is the measure. It still is the measure. So what those guys did, Roger and John Landy and all the rest of them, was phenomenal, in my view. Because, as Paula rightly says, we cannot measure the difference between what's available today and what wasn't available for them. But nonetheless, even if he'd stepped onto track today at his tender age, to be fair, at the time still, and did a 4-minute mile, it's even today, we'd still go, okay, top, that was pretty good. It was very good. Amazing. Hand went up, yes, sir.
About nature and nurture. In the film, we heard that when he was at school, he was walking quite a way to school. Was that nature or was that nurture? And do you, as athletes, have something similar when you were in your childhood that maybe was giving you the extra little bit to maybe become champions?
So if you couldn't hear that, was that the sort of nature-nurture argument? It's not an argument, I guess.
I think we had a talk by Ben Smith earlier on about bullying as one of the motivations for him doing his amazing 401 marathons in 401 days. And there's no doubt that my father, when during the war he was evacuated to Bath, experienced bullying, and he actually found his running ability when he ran away from boys he thought were going to beat him up. So also when he arrived in Oxford, it didn't actually touch 90% of the undergraduates at Oxford at the time when he went up at 17 were ex-servicemen. So only 10% were 17-year-olds or 18-year-olds. And he was very young. He'd been offered a place at Cambridge at 16 and Oxford at 16 and went up at 17. So his immaturity, again, running gave him a place amongst those amazing war heroes. So I think for my father, there was ability and there was genetics, but there was also the big why run, and what it gave him in life. And I think without the why, you probably can't achieve the heights that he did. But I'd be really interested what Paula and Laura think.
Oh, I think you've hit the nail on the head a little bit there. I think it's not really nature versus nurture so much as the innate desire to run and actually loving what you're doing and so why you're actually running. Because I think most people probably have the ability, if they want to train hard and to nurture the ability to get to a certain level. And then there's the little bit on the top that is just the natural talent. But part of that natural talent is the talent to be able to push yourself hard, to train hard, to want to put in the investment, to then come through the hard times, but also enjoy the racing and to keep coming back. So I think it's a lot of things mixed together. I think my coach used to say it can be 10% talent and it can be 90% hard work, but you can't have 90% talent and 10% hard work because you're never going to get there.
Yeah, I think definitely for me, I would totally agree with that. And I think for me, sort of like my family upbringing probably brought out of me that kind of like competitive instinct and wanting to run. I think I always loved running, but coming from a family, I'm one of 5, it was a very natural competitive environment growing up. And we were a very active family, and no matter what you were doing as a family, you always had to be the best. It could be the simplest of card games, but it would cause absolute chaos within the family if you didn't win. So I think kind of growing up, that really ignited my competitive streak, and I only took that into running when I got into the sport, in my early teens. So I think having that as an early child in a very active family with a competitive element there, it was already in me, that kind of determination to want to do better. And I probably wasn't the most talented athlete at all. It was that I brought to the sport that probably pulled that little bit of talent out of me that allowed me to get the best out of myself.
Yeah, and I think they've both answered it in the way which we'd all say that it's a combination, and every single individual is different. You have to have bits of both. But Paula's right, and actually Laura's right, that there is an awful lot of talented people out there. They just don't know it. They haven't actually even tried to run or pole vault or trampoline or whatever it is. So part of it is opportunity. But actually running is an open opportunity. There's lots of opportunities to run. So we can have that talent, but these two are great examples of people who put an awful lot of hard work. Do not underestimate that. The nature is great, but the nurture thing is so important. I sometimes think the demise of industrialization in this country has got a lot to answer for a lack of middle distance success. Because myself and Brendan Foster and David Sharp from Jarrow as well, David was a world junior champion, we all lived within a quarter of a mile of the coke ovens in Hebburn. So it may well have been the coke ovens that were the real factor, I don't know, but probably not. But no, it is. The one thing I'll say as well, that why, that desire, sort of helping a couple of other people now. Laura was the first person who ever asked me if I could help them. She was the first person to ask if I would coach them. And I had a good few years of running and doing things, but she was the first one to ask. That is a big thing to do. For some of that, that's Laura's ambition. You have to have that ambition. That planning that you have to think. You have to think it first before you do it. And that's an important thing as well. It's something which not everybody has the ability to kind of set targets for themselves that are a stretch, but then by small steps, become achievable without getting too much into them. Right, I want more questions from the audience. Yes. Lady first, and I'll go behind you. Yeah. Yes. Sorry, because it's dark out there and I'm pointing. So there's a microphone behind you.
What moves and impresses me very much when I listen to all this and I think about sport in general, and I'm, hopeless at sport, is that I think there's something very moving about a kind of what I would call courage and a kind of deep inner belief to reach inside yourself and, in a sense, go for, if you like, the loneliness of the runner, And I wonder very much if in the world we live in, and I'm thinking particularly as somebody who is involved in both teaching and social work, is that we don't actually give to children enough the feeling that all of you have within yourself, each child has within themselves, that kind of, if you like, beautiful thing of your own identity, your own inner being, and your own self-belief that we should cultivate. And I think that's what impresses me about people who become excellent at anything. But particularly, I think, when Charlotte read from her father's book about running is simple, you don't need a lot of equipment or whatever, that you can just run and you can take great delight in it. I think it is the beauty of reaching inside yourself, having that kind of courage and that aiming for excellence. And I think we need more of it in society. And I think, like you said, Steve, hundreds and thousands of millions of people have got that capacity, but we never really facilitate people enough to go for it and find it. And we should do more of it.
We've been trying to over the last 2-3 days, but yes. No, but
I think you're
agree.
doing it.
Yeah,
you're doing it,
I agree that, and I'll bring the guys in very quickly on that, but because I'm sure Roger would have enjoyed and had enjoyed, the running, even from when I started, where it was still athletic clubs, and probably not that dissimilar to Roger's day as a youngster, but then since the early 80s, woof. And I think I read somewhere the other day that over 8 million people will have done an organised running event this year in the UK in 2019. So there's a lot of people out there running, and it's something which has changed. Certainly in your time, Paula, to some extent. Laura's probably grown up with the whole running boom thing, but it is good to see, isn't it?
It is good to see, but I think there's a flip side to that. And while we're seeing so many more people actually running, competitive running, club running, is not as strong as it was. I mean, I can remember people talk about it all the time. My first under-13 national cross-country was at Leicester in 1986, and there were 605 people in the race, and that was the under-13 girls' race. There wouldn't be that today. And I think that is a sign that we're just not... And it's partly a factor of the fact that there are a lot more sports available to the kids wanting to get involved in sport, but I also think there are also too many other distractions available to them away from the sporting exercise side of it. So there are a lot less kids actually coming into our sport. So of course that means that we're not going to be as strong at the top level because the numbers coming through just aren't enough in the bottom.
Just picking up on both those things to some extent, do you think Roger would have been, your dad, would have been as successful in his other life without the success that he enjoyed on the track? Did that help mould him? Did it give him the confidence, if you like, picking up that point about what sport can do to people, give them a sense of their own ability to achieve anything?
I think that's a hard question to answer because my father was a man of excellence and acutely hardworking and would always strive in whatever he was trying to do for the impossible. Especially when he was trying to sail a boat across the Solent and he had no idea how to sail. So, which he met with great dignity and also failure. But it was one of the very few things that he failed at in his life. But I think that the point that Esther just made, if I may say, as a clergy woman, is about the image of God within you, made in the image of God. And so as a priest, when I hear what you're saying, is about ability to have an element of, in the second commandment, I'm not going to go all religious, that's Sunday morning, but the second commandment is love your neighbour as yourself. And the importance of learning to love yourself and therefore enable yourself to reach for goals. You said to me, am I a runner? I'm not really a runner, but I'm inspired by Steve and what he's given our family over the last year. And I'm going to become a runner again. Even at this ripe old age, I think there's something left in me, and it was a promise I made to my father in myself on the day he died, that I would take up running. So this sense of, can I do it, is one question. But do I have within me the love of something, of both myself in a non-selfish way, which is really a difficult concept for young people nowadays to get their hands around, to do something for the glory of something greater than yourself. And I think that that's what my father did. He wasn't a deeply religious man. He came to my services basically to pick apart my sermon on Sunday lunchtime and mark them out of 10. And I didn't get very high marks, you can imagine. And I think he struggled with self-love in the best sense of the word, actually, through his life. But that, I think, is the essence of what you can achieve through running. A sense of liberation and a sense of running not just for your own time and your own best, but for something greater than yourself. And if young people can have an understanding of that, I think it's amazingly freeing. And my father did talk about the freedom in running and the love of running and the freedom it gave him.
I can't think of a better way to end. I think his inspiration to generations of people after, which continues today, is something which he probably never appreciated. I don't know. I hope he did. He certainly inspired my life and still does, I guess, in terms of what I do. I'm still sitting here talking about 4 Minute Mile. And for Laura and Paula and for an awful lot of people out there. Please help me thank Laura and Paula, but our special guest, Charlotte Bannister, who's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much, Charlotte. That's it for this evening. Those of you who have got rainproof gear, if you want to come and watch Families on Track, the first ever Families on Track, which is Paula's concept idea, which we'll be running tomorrow. There's 100 families coming to take part, which is fabulous. Team Radcliffe are the favourites, so you can't get any price on them at the bookies. But we're looking forward to that. If not, then I hope you've enjoyed just this part of what's been a great, will end up tomorrow as being a great 3 days. And we'd love to see you all again next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I wonder if we can do that.